The letter was still in Rosa Grady's hand when Silas Walden walked through the door of the Dusty Creek post office, and the way her face crumpled the moment she saw him told him everything and nothing all at once. She had been crying. Not the soft, dignified kind of crying that polite women in 1882 were supposed to do behind closed doors, but the raw, shaking kind that left red blotches on the cheeks and made the eyes go glassy and strange. She was gripping a folded piece of paper so tightly that the edges had gone soft with the sweat of her palm, and when she saw him step through the doorway with his deputy's badge catching the afternoon light, she took one step backward as if she meant to run. He stopped dead on the threshold. "Rosa." His voice came out low, stripped of its usual careful steadiness. "What happened?" She looked at him the way a person looks at someone they have just discovered in a dream they never meant to have, and then she thrust the letter out at arm's length, and her voice broke clean in half when she spoke. "Did you write this?" He crossed the room in 3 steps. He took the letter from her hand. He read it, and by the time he reached the 3rd line, the blood had left his face entirely. Because the letter was addressed to Eleanor Marsh, the schoolteacher who boarded at the widow Paulson's house on the east edge of town. And it was a love letter, undeniably and beautifully so, the kind of letter that a man writes only once in his life if he is lucky, the kind that lays the whole interior of a person open like a field after rain. And the handwriting was his. He knew every curve of it. But he had never written it. Rosa watched his expression go through 3 different kinds of shock in the space of 4 seconds, and she whispered, "Your handwriting, Silas. It is your handwriting on every line." He turned the paper over. He looked at the address on the back. He looked at the seal, which had already been broken, and then he looked at Rosa again, and the thing that hit him hardest was not the accusation in her eyes. It was the grief. She was not angry at him because she was jealous of Eleanor Marsh. She was not confronting him over some petty rivalry. She was looking at him with the face of a woman who had just learned that the person she trusted most in the world had a secret she had never been permitted to see, and that secret had reached her in the most humiliating possible way, through a letter that was never meant for her hands at all. 3 weeks before that afternoon, Rosa Grady had arrived in Dusty Creek, Texas, by the southbound stage from San Antonio, with 2 trunks, a sewing kit, a dog-eared copy of Charles Dickens, and no plan beyond lasting until something better presented itself. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a cattle broker who had died owing more money than he had ever made, and she had come to Dusty Creek because her late father's only remaining friend, a retired gambler named Hector Potts, had written to say there was work at the general store and a room above the post office if she wanted it. It was not a glamorous offer. But Rosa Grady had learned early that glamour was a luxury, and surviving was the actual business of living. The town of Dusty Creek sat in a shallow valley between 2 ragged limestone ridges in south-central Texas, population 342 on a good day, with a church, a saloon, a school, a bank, a jail, a livery stable, a doctor's office, and enough dust in the air on a dry afternoon to make a person feel like they were breathing the land itself. The railroad had come through 12 miles to the north 6 years earlier, which meant Dusty Creek was just connected enough to the modern world to feel its pull without being changed much by it. The town's law was kept by Sheriff Amos Prout, who was 60 years old, arthritic in both knees, and deeply committed to spending his afternoons in the rocking chair outside the jail playing checkers with whoever would sit still long enough. The real work fell to his deputy, Silas Walden, who was 28, broad-shouldered, quiet in the particular way that men who have seen hard things are quiet, and possessed of a reputation for being scrupulously, almost stubbornly, fair. Rosa first saw Silas on her 3rd morning in town, when she was sweeping the front step of the post office where she had taken a part-time job sorting mail and selling stamps. He was walking past with a wanted poster rolled under his arm, wearing his badge and his hat against the morning sun, and he did not look at her the way most men in small towns look at a new woman, with that calculating, measuring sort of curiosity that made her skin prickle. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone standing in front of a window with the light behind them, as if trying to make out the shape of something important. "Morning," he said, and kept walking. She swept her step and thought nothing more of it. It was Hector Potts who explained the town's social geography to her that first week, over coffee and corn bread in his small house off the main street, talking in the leisurely, digressive way of old men who have decided they have earned the right to meander. Dusty Creek had its factions, he told her. There were the old ranching families, the Hollanders and the Meachers and the Brents, who had been here since before the war, and who regarded any new arrival with the polite suspicion of people protecting territory they had earned through suffering. There were the newer settlers, mostly from the East and Midwest, who had come after the railroad and were still in the process of establishing themselves. And then there was a smaller, more complicated group, which included the Mexican families who had been on this land longer than anyone else, and who navigated the town's politics with the careful dignity of people who have had long practice in being simultaneously essential and invisible. Rosa, who had grown up in San Antonio and spoken Spanish before she spoke English with any fluency, paid particular attention to that last part. The post office where she worked was run by a man named Arthur Crane, who was 55, cheerful, and somewhat deaf in his left ear from a cannon blast at Chickamauga. He sorted the mail each morning with the methodical pleasure of a man who took genuine joy in the organization of information, and he had a system for everything, a slot for every ranch, a bundle for every family name, a separate section for anything that looked official or important. Rosa learned his system in 2 days and improved it subtly in 3. And Arthur Crane told her she was the finest assistant he had ever had and gave her a 10-cent raise, which she accepted with a dignity that concealed her profound relief. It was the mail sorting that brought her into regular, unavoidable proximity with the private lives of Dusty Creek. Not that she read people's letters. She was scrupulous about that. But she knew who was corresponding with whom, and she knew when something arrived that seemed unexpected or out of place, and she had, after 3 weeks, developed a working map of the town's emotional weather. She knew, for instance, that Eleanor Marsh, the schoolteacher, received 2 letters a week from a sister in Missouri. She knew that Sheriff Prout corresponded with a nephew in Austin who was studying law. She knew that the Hollander family was in some kind of protracted legal dispute over land boundaries, because their attorneys' letters came with increasing frequency and increasing thickness. And she knew that Silas Walden received almost no personal mail at all, which struck her as both interesting and sad. She had got to know Silas in the natural way that people get to know each other in small towns, through repeated proximity and accumulated small moments. He came in every few days to collect whatever official mail came to the sheriff's office, and she handed it over the counter with the same efficiency she brought to everything, and he thanked her with the same economy of expression he brought to everything, and for the first week it was entirely transactional. Then one morning she dropped a bundle of sorted letters, and he was standing close enough to catch half of them before they hit the floor. And when they both straightened up at the same moment, they were close enough that she could see the particular shade of his eyes, which were not quite green and not quite gray, but something in between that she did not have a precise word for. "Thank you," she said. "Careful hands are an occupational requirement," he said, and there was a dry humor in it that surprised her because she had taken him for entirely serious. "And clumsy ones are apparently my qualification," she said. He almost smiled. She could see it happen and then not happen, the slight lift at one corner of his mouth. He handed her the recovered letters and went out, and she stood at the counter for a moment with a peculiar sensation in her chest that she chose not to examine too closely. After that, they spoke more. Not in grand, significant ways, but in the small, incremental way that constitutes real acquaintance. He asked about her family once, with careful tact, because he had clearly heard something of the circumstances that brought her here. She told him about her father with more honesty than she usually managed, about the debts and the disappointment and the particular grief of watching a man you loved turn himself inside out with want. He listened in a way that was not pity, which she appreciated more than she could say. She learned that he was from East Texas originally, that he had been a deputy in Dusty Creek for 4 years, that before that there had been a period he did not talk about easily, and that he had a younger sister in Galveston whom he was quietly, persistently supporting from his deputy's salary. She learned that he took his responsibilities seriously to a degree that occasionally looked like rigidity but was, upon closer examination, something more like devotion. He believed in the town's safety the way some men believed in religion, with a personal, interior conviction that made him consistent even when consistency was difficult. She did not let herself think about the color of his eyes again, or the way he said her name in those rare moments when he forgot to be formal about it, as if it had 2 syllables and both of them mattered. The town itself was doing its ordinary business, which in 1882 in south-central Texas meant cattle drives through in the spring and fall, the occasional dispute over water rights or grazing boundaries, a steady trickle of travelers moving west, and the background noise of a world that was changing faster than any individual could quite track. The railroad was bringing newspapers from as far away as New York. There was talk of a telegraph line coming to town. The Comanche raids that had terrorized the region 15 years earlier were a fading memory, replaced by different anxieties, economic ones mostly, the boom and bust of cattle prices, the enclosure of open range, the slow grinding pressure of a frontier turning reluctantly into something organized and civic. It was against this background that the trouble began, which was not the romantic trouble between Rosa and Silas, though that was coming, but a different kind of trouble, the kind that wears a respectable face and does its worst damage in private. A man named Conrad Hale had come to Dusty Creek 6 weeks before Rosa's arrival, presenting himself as a land speculator from Denver with money to invest and opportunities to offer. He was somewhere in his 40s, well-dressed by frontier standards, with a silver watch chain and a manner that was precisely calibrated to seem trustworthy without actually being trustworthy. He had taken rooms at the Dusty Creek Hotel, bought drinks for the right people, and begun attending church with the kind of conspicuous piety that made Hector Potts, who noticed such things, quietly suspicious. Rosa became aware of Conrad Hale in her 2nd week, because he began coming to the post office with unusual frequency, collecting mail and sending letters that he carried already sealed in his coat pocket. There was nothing inherently suspicious about this, but something in his manner when he came to the counter made her careful. He was too pleasant in a way that felt like a technique, and his eyes never quite matched his smile. Silas had been watching Hale longer than Rosa had, and with considerably more specific concern. He mentioned it to her one morning when he came to collect the sheriff's mail and found her alone, Arthur Crane having stepped out for his constitutional. "Has Hale been in regularly?" he asked, with a casualness that was not quite casual enough. "Every 2 or 3 days," she said. "He collects and sends. I cannot tell you what he sends because I do not read sealed letters and he seals them before he comes here." "I know you do not read them," he said quickly, and there was a particular emphasis in it, a trust stated plainly, that warmed her in a way she was not expecting. "What is he doing?" she asked. "I do not know yet," Silas said. "And until I know, I cannot act. The law is particular about that. Even when you are certain something is wrong, especially then," he said. "Because certainty without evidence is just instinct, and I have seen too many men destroyed by other men's instincts." She looked at him steadily. "What is your instinct telling you about Hale?" He met her eyes, and something shifted in his expression, a brief, involuntary openness, as if she had asked a question that reached past the professional barrier he maintained with practiced consistency. "That this town is being prepared for something," he said. "The way you prepare land before you plant something in it." by removing whatever was already there. It was the most she had ever heard him say in one stretch, and the weight of it settled over her like a change in the weather. Meanwhile, there was Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor was 26, beautiful in a fine-boned, particular way that made people use words like refined, and she taught the town's children their letters and numbers with a patience and skill that earned her genuine respect. She was friendly with Rosa in the way that women in small communities are sometimes friendly with newcomers, cautious and cordial and waiting to see. Rosa liked her. That was the simple truth. And she had no reason to believe that Eleanor occupied any particular place in Silas Walden's interior life, because he treated Eleanor with the same steady, contained courtesy he extended to everyone, which Rosa had learned was his default mode rather than evidence of particular feeling. She realized in retrospect, been carefully not thinking about whether Silas had feelings for anyone at all, because thinking about it required acknowledging why she cared, and she was not ready for that acknowledgement. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in the southbound stage's mail bag, addressed to Miss Eleanor Marsh in handwriting that Rosa, who had by now handled enough of Silas Walden's official correspondence to know his script precisely, recognized instantly. There was no return address. The paper was quality stock, cream-colored, slightly heavier than the standard. The seal was simple wax, no stamp. She held it for a moment longer than she should have, aware that her hands had gone slightly cold. Then she set it in Eleanor Marsh's slot and went about her morning, and tried not to think about it, and failed entirely. By midday she had constructed 3 different explanations for why Silas might be writing to Eleanor Marsh. None of them were comfortable. The most straightforward one, that he was in love with Eleanor and had been all along, and Rosa had been invisible to him even when she thought they were building something real in the spaces between professional exchanges, landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. By afternoon she had almost managed to be reasonable about it, had almost talked herself into a posture of mature acceptance, when Eleanor Marsh came in and Rosa handed over her mail and watched Eleanor's face as she flipped through the bundle and found the cream-colored envelope, and Eleanor's face did something strange. She did not light up. She did not flush or soften. She looked, if anything, slightly alarmed, and she tucked that particular letter beneath the others very quickly and murmured something about needing to get back to the school and left before Rosa could find anything to say. Which was peculiar enough that Rosa turned it over in her mind all through the closing of the post office, all through her walk to the small room she rented above it, and all through the early evening, until she could not sleep and sat at her table in the dark listening to the town settle around her. The next morning, when she came downstairs to open the post office, she found something she had not expected. The letter was back, not in Eleanor's slot. It was sitting on the counter, sealed and readdressed, now bearing Rosa's own name on the outside in a different hand, cramped and urgent, and beneath her name a single line, "Read this. You need to know what he is doing." She looked at it for a long time. She looked at the door, which was still locked. She looked at the window, which showed the empty early morning street. Then she broke the seal and read the letter that Silas Walden had apparently written to Eleanor Marsh, and by the time she reached the last line she was trembling in a way she could not entirely account for, because the letter was not a love letter at all. Or rather, it was a love letter, but it was not written to Eleanor, and it was not written by Silas. It had been written in Silas's hand because someone had gone to the considerable trouble of forging it, had copied his script with careful, practiced skill, and it was addressed to Eleanor as a vehicle, as a way of delivering information to a specific reader, which turned out not to be Eleanor and not to be Rosa, but was clearly intended to eventually reach someone who would understand its contents. The letter spoke of a hidden land transaction, of a deed buried in the county recorder's office in the next town, filed under a false name, of a scheme to acquire title to the grazing land south of Dusty Creek through a series of fraudulent transfers that would, in 6 weeks' time, leave 3 ranching families legally landless with no warning and no recourse. And threaded through it, in language that was careful and coded but not careful enough to withstand a reader who was genuinely paying attention, was a name: Conrad Hale. Rosa was still holding the letter when Silas walked through the door. She watched his face go through shock and then something darker when he read it, and she said quietly, "Your handwriting. Someone copied it perfectly. Who would know it well enough to do that?" He set the letter down on the counter and was quiet for a moment that felt very long. "Someone who has handled my official paperwork," he said. "Someone who has been in proximity to the sheriff's office documents." He paused. "Someone who knew the letter would reach a leaner and knew that a leaner would panic and redirect it and knew that it would find its way to you." Rosa stared at him. "So this was arranged deliberately, to reach me, to reach someone who would read it and understand what it means." His eyes met hers. "Someone who handles information professionally and who has the discretion to use it correctly. Who knows enough about me to think I would be that person." He was quiet again and she watched him work through it. "Hector Potts," he said at last. Rosa put her hand over her mouth. Because of course it was. Hector Potts, who had written to her in San Antonio. Hector Potts, who had found her the job and the room and had sat across a table from her explaining the social geography of Dusty Creek with his leisurely, digressive, apparently artless specificity. Hector Potts, who had known enough about Conrad Hale to be quietly suspicious and had apparently known enough about the scheme to write this letter but not enough power to act on it alone. She dropped her hand. "He is afraid to bring it forward himself. He is 70 years old and has no official standing, and Conrad Hale is connected to men with money," Silas said. "Yes, he is afraid, and rightly so. He needed someone who would take it to someone who could act. He chose an elaborate method," Rosa said. "He could not send it directly to me. If Hale's people are watching the mail, a letter from Hector Potts to the deputy sheriff would disappear before it arrived." Silas looked at her steadily. "He sent it through a channel that would look innocent from the outside, a personal letter, to a woman, redirected by chance or seeming chance. He forged your handwriting to make it look personal, so that anyone inspecting it would dismiss it as sentiment rather than intelligence." Rosa absorbed this. There was something extraordinary in the complexity of it, and also something that made her ache a little for Hector Potts, old and frightened and clever, building this elaborate paper bridge to carry a dangerous piece of truth from one side of something to the other. "What do we do?" she said. He looked at her for a moment, and she felt the weight of the word she had used, the ease with which she had said it, the assumption it contained that they were a we in any meaningful sense. He did not correct it. "We go see Hector," he said. They went in the middle of the morning, separately and 5 minutes apart, so as not to look like they were going together, which was a practical precaution that nevertheless felt intimate in its coordination. The way that shared secrets feel intimate even when the secrets belong to other people. Hector Potts opened his door at Silas's knock with an expression that combined relief and anxiety in roughly equal measure, and when he saw Rosa standing just behind, he let out a long breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and held. "You found her," he said to Silas. "She found me," Silas said. "Or the letter found both of us, which I suspect was your intention." Hector stepped back to let them in. His house smelled of coffee and old paper and something baked, and it was filled with the accumulated possessions of a long, varied life, books and cards, and a violin in the corner that she had never seen him play. He poured coffee without asking if they wanted it and sat down across from them at his small table and folded his hands. He told them the story with the methodical precision of a man who had been organizing it in his head for weeks, waiting for this moment. 6 months ago, he had won a card game from a drunk land agent named Purnell who worked for the county recorder's office in Harker Springs, the next town over. In payment for his debt, Purnell had told Hector something he thought was a simple piece of gossip about a land transaction gone sideways, not knowing that Hector would recognize what it meant or that Hector had any reason to care. The transaction involved a series of documents that had been filed to create the appearance of a legal chain of title to the grazing land south of Dusty Creek, land currently leased and used by three families, the Brents, the Meachers, and a Mexican family named Reyes who had been on that land before Texas was a state. The documents were fraudulent, created by altering dates and forging signatures on old surveys. They had been filed quietly, incrementally, over 18 months, in a way that was designed to look like routine property transfers. And they bore, at their origin, the sponsoring name of a Denver land company called Consolidated Western Holdings, of which Conrad Hale was the registered local agent. If the scheme proceeded unchallenged for another 6 weeks, the fraudulent title would vest and Hale's company would have legal standing to evict all three families from land they had worked for generations. Hector had tried to approach Sheriff Pruitt and been gently dismissed, the sheriff politely disbelieving the testimony of a retired gambler against a well-dressed Denver businessman with references. He had tried writing to the county seat and received no response. He had spent 2 months being quietly desperate until he wrote to Rosa in San Antonio, not merely to offer her a job and a room, but to bring her here, because he needed someone with intelligence and access and no established position in the town's existing power structure, someone who could serve as the pivoting point of a plan. Rosa sat across from him and felt a complicated mixture of things. She had been a piece in his plan without knowing it, which should have made her angry, and it did a little. But she could also see the desperation behind it, the limited options of an old man who had tried every legitimate channel and found them closed, and who had been driven to this elaborate indirection because he had no power except what he could borrow from other people's positions. "Why my handwriting?" Silas asked. Hector looked at him squarely. "Because I needed the letter to travel safely and land in the right hands. A personal letter from me to anyone in this town would be suspect. A love letter in an unknown hand would be opened and discarded. But your handwriting, deputy, would be recognized by anyone who knew your official correspondence, and it would create enough of a stir that the right people would pay attention." He paused. "I am sorry for the liberty." Rosa looked at Silas. Silas looked at the coffee cup in his hands. "You could have simply told me," he said to Hector. "I tried 6 weeks ago. You were standing in the street outside the sheriff's office, and I said Hale was worth watching, and you said you were already watching him, and I had no evidence to offer you at that moment." Hector's voice was steady, but his hands were not. "I needed to give you the evidence and protect myself long enough to do it." Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Where is Purnell now?" "Harker Springs, still employed at the recorder's office, still working for the people who created those documents, and frightened enough of them that I do not think he will speak voluntarily." "But there are documents," Rosa said, "physical documents filed at the recorder's office." "Yes, which are public record. In theory. In practice, they would be made very difficult to access by someone with enough influence over the office's operations." Rosa looked at Silas. "Could you compel their production? Legally?" He was already thinking along this line. She could see it in the way his jaw had set. "With the right writ from the right judge. Not Judge Calloway, who owes his appointment to 2 of the same men behind this, but Judge Harmon in Austin has a reputation for integrity, and he owes nothing to anyone in this county." He paused. "I would need to go to Austin." "That will take time," Hector said. "I know. A week, perhaps 10 days if I push hard. The telegraph might serve, but I would rather present this in person and have Harmon's signature on paper before anyone knows I am seeking it." Silas set down his coffee cup. "In the meantime, Hale must not be alarmed. If he suspects his scheme has been uncovered, he will accelerate his timeline or disappear, and the families affected will have no recourse either way. You need someone to watch him while you are gone," Rosa said. He looked at her with an expression that was almost protective, and she read it before he could speak. "I am not volunteering to play the amateur detective," she said firmly. "I am saying that I see what comes in and goes out of this post office, And if there is anything in that mail flow that tells us his plans are shifting, I am in a position to know it. She held his gaze. That is not dangerous. It is observational. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she felt the heat of it with a self-consciousness she was not used to feeling. Observational, he agreed at last. Nothing more. Silas left for Austin on the Thursday stage, having told Sheriff Prout he was following a lead on a wanted man that required him to be away for a week. It was not precisely a lie. Prout, who trusted Silas with the sort of comfortable completeness that comes from 4 years of consistent performance, asked no further questions. The week that followed was one of the most peculiar of Rosa's life, which had already contained considerable peculiarity. She went about her work at the post office with careful normalcy. Conrad Hale came in on his regular days, and she gave him his mail with the same pleasant efficiency she gave everyone. He sent his sealed letters, and she accepted them and asked no questions, and gave him no reason to think she was anything other than what she appeared, which was a competent, unremarkable young woman doing a clerical job. But she was watching. She was watching the volume and the patterns. And on the 4th day, something shifted. He came in twice in one day, which he had not done before, and both times he was sending letters, fast and emphatic in the way he put them on the counter, as if urgency had leaked into even this small transaction. She wrote it down in the careful, precise note she was keeping for Silas, describing not the contents of letters she had not opened but the observable facts of frequency and behavior. Hector came to visit her in the evening, and she read him what she had written, and he looked troubled. "He may be accelerating," Hector said, "if he has heard something, even a rumor that suggests an inquiry is coming. How would he hear anything? Only you and I and Silas know. And Purnell, who is a drunk and a talker." Rosa pressed her lips together. "How long before the title fully vests if he accelerates his timeline? At the pace those letters suggest, perhaps 3 weeks instead of 6. Then Silas needs to be faster." She looked at the clock on the wall, the steady mechanical marking of a crisis she could not stop from where she stood. "Can you get a message to him? The telegraph at Harker Springs goes to Austin, but anyone could read it. Then we write it in terms that look personal." She was already reaching for paper. "You are his uncle. You are writing to say the family gathering is happening sooner than expected, and he should come home early if he can manage it." Hector looked at her for a moment with an expression that was somewhere between admiration and something softer, the look of a man who has placed a bet on a long shot and is watching the horse run. "His uncle," he said. "His uncle," Rosa confirmed and began to write. The telegram went out the next morning. 2 days later, Silas walked back into Dusty Creek 4 days ahead of schedule with a writ from Judge Harmon in his coat pocket, and an expression that told her he had received her message and understood it entirely. He came to the post office in the early afternoon when Arthur Crane was at lunch, and he stood at the counter and she showed him her notes, and he read them with his full attention in the way he did everything, and when he looked up there was something in his face that she had not seen there before. "You did well," he said, and the simplicity of it landed differently than she expected, not patronizing, not condescending, just honest, the same way he said everything. "What does the writ give you?" she asked. "Access to the records office, the right to compel production of any filed documents in the relevant land parcel records. And Judge Harmon has written separately to the circuit court at Harker Springs alerting them to a potential fraud investigation, which means the local machinery cannot simply make the documents disappear." He folded her notes carefully and put them in his coat. "I am going to Harker Springs tomorrow. I need one piece more. Purnell. If he will talk to me, voluntarily on record." He paused. "He is a frightened man." Frightened men are sometimes easier to move than proud ones because they can be offered protection, and protection is what they actually want. "And if he will not talk, the documents alone may be sufficient, but testimony would make it cleaner." She looked at him, at the badge on his chest and the careful line of his mouth and the eyes that were still the same unnameable shade of gray and green, and she felt something press against the inside of her chest with an insistence that was getting harder to dismiss. "Be careful in Harker Springs," she said. "If Hale's people have influence there, they will be watching the records office." He looked at her for a moment with an intensity that had nothing to do with the investigation. "I know," he said. "I will." He left in the morning and was back by evening, which was faster than she had expected, and which meant either everything had gone smoothly or nothing had. She was closing up the post office when she heard his boots on the step and turned to find him in the doorway, dusty from the road and with an expression that was still too controlled to read. She waited. "Purnell talked," he said. He was frightened enough of the alternative that he talked for 2 hours and signed a sworn statement. The documents are what Hector said they were: fraudulent filings, forged signatures, falsified surveys. All traceable back to Consolidated Western Holdings and its registered agent. Hale. He leaned against the doorframe. "I have what I need to arrest him and to notify the affected families and to file the challenge to the fraudulent title with the circuit court." Rosa let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like days. "When?" she said. "Tomorrow morning, before he has time to hear anything and run." "Will Sheriff Prout support it?" "I told him everything tonight. He was angrier than I have seen him in 4 years, including the time someone stole his horse." A brief, genuine smile crossed his face, quick and warm and gone almost before she could register it. "He will be there," she nodded. "Good." She started to turn back to the counter, to finish the closing up routine that her hands remembered even when her head was somewhere else. "Rosa," she turned back. He was looking at her with the same intensity from the afternoon, but without the professional restraint now, or with less of it, the restraint present but under pressure, like a door held against wind. "The note you sent," he said. "The telegram. You read the situation correctly and you moved at exactly the right moment." He paused. "That matters. You matter to this, to the way it resolved." She stood very still. "I was glad I could help," she said, because it was the true thing and the safe thing both, and she was not yet ready to step off the edge of the safe thing. He held her gaze for another moment, and she thought he was going to say something else, something that would require both of them to acknowledge what had been accumulating between them in all those small moments and careful conversations. But he did not. He put his hat back on and said good night and went out into the dark street. She stood at the counter for a full minute after he left, her hand on the closed ledger, listening to his footsteps fade. The arrest happened the next morning with a directness that Conrad Hale clearly had not anticipated, because he had spent the last several weeks conducting his business as if he were untouchable, which was what usually happened when a man had been allowed to feel that way for long enough. Silas and Sheriff Prout walked into the Dusty Creek Hotel at 8 in the morning and found Hale at breakfast, and the conversation that followed was brief and not gentle, and ended with Hale in handcuffs and Prout wearing the expression of a man who has just exercised a muscle he had been neglecting and found it still worked. Hale said, as men like him always did, that he had connections and that there would be consequences, and that they had no idea who they were dealing with. Silas listened to this with the patience of someone who has heard it before, and then said, with the particular quiet steadiness that was more effective than anger, that they were aware of exactly who they were dealing with, and that was why they had been so thorough. The circuit court in Harker Springs received the challenge to the fraudulent title that same afternoon. A rider was sent to the Brent and Meacher ranches with official notification that the threat to their land had been identified and was being legally contested. A separate rider went to the Ray's family, and Rosa, knowing something about the anxiety of waiting for justice that might not come, wrote that letter herself in Spanish, making sure that what it said was clear and complete, and that the family would understand they were not overlooked. That evening, the town had the particular electric quality of a community that has just learned it was threatened and saved simultaneously. A buzzing, restless energy that expressed itself in clusters of conversation outside the saloon and the general store and the church steps, people processing what had happened and what it meant, and who knew what and when. Rosa sat on the step outside the post office in the cooling evening and watched the town talk to itself. Hector Potts appeared beside her at some point, moving slowly with his cane, and sat down next to her on the step with the careful deliberateness of a man for whom sitting down is still an accomplishment. "It worked," he said. "It worked," she agreed. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for using you without your knowledge, for bringing you here under false pretenses." Rosa looked at the street for a moment. "You brought me here with an honest job offer, an honest lodging, and a community that needed something I could provide. The rest of it I chose when the choice was presented to me." "You are generous. I am practical," she paused, "and I am glad I came." He looked at her sideways with the alert, slightly wicked intelligence of a man who has spent a long life reading people. "Yes," he said, "I imagine you are." She did not dignify that with a response, but she felt the warmth of it move through her like a second thought. The weeks that followed the arrest were, on the surface, quieter. The circuit court processed the challenge to the title with the efficiency that Judge Harmon's personal involvement encouraged. And by the end of the month, the fraudulent filings had been voided, and the 3 affected families had received official confirmation that their land claims were secure. Hale was transported to the county seat for trial, where his connections turned out to be considerably less useful than he had expected, because the documentary evidence was comprehensive and Purnell's testimony was unimpeachable. But beneath the surface quiet, something else was happening, slower and less dramatic and considerably more personal. Silas Walden, who had for 4 years maintained a professional remove from the emotional life of Dusty Creek, had apparently lost the ability to maintain his remove from Rosa Grady. She noticed this because she was paying attention in a way she had not previously allowed herself to acknowledge she was doing, and what she noticed was a series of small, consistent changes in his behavior around her. He found reasons to come to the post office more often than his mail volume required. He extended conversations that he would previously have concluded at their natural stopping point. Once, when she was struggling with a stuck window in the back of the post office on an unusually warm October afternoon, he appeared without being asked and fixed it with 3 efficient movements, and then stood there for a moment longer than the fix required, talking about nothing in particular in the careful way of a man who is trying to establish whether his presence is welcome. It was welcome. She let it be visible that it was welcome, in the small incremental ways that women in 1882 were permitted to signal such things, in sustained eye contact, and in responses that opened rather than closed conversations, and in the particular quality of attention she gave him that she did not give anyone else. Eleanor Marsh, to her credit, seemed to be aware of none of this as a source of jealousy, and all of it as a source of mild amusement. She stopped Rosa one morning on the way to the school with a friendly frankness that Rosa appreciated. "I imagine the forged letter situation was alarming," Eleanor said, with a slight smile. "I was alarmed myself, receiving what appeared to be a declaration from Deputy Walden, which I was quite certain was impossible given that Deputy Walden has spent the past month looking at you rather than at anyone else." Rosa felt color rise in her face. "The looking is professional," she said, with as much dignity as she could manage. Eleanor gave her the look of a woman who teaches children for a living and has therefore seen every variety of transparent self-deception. "If you say so," she said pleasantly, and continued to the school. It was late October, a cool, clear morning with the smell of the approaching winter already in the air, when things moved from the incremental to the actual. Rosa had arrived at the post office early and was sorting the morning's mail when she found another letter with Silas's handwriting, and for a brief disorienting moment her heart did the same thing it had done the first time. Then she read the address. It was addressed to her name in his handwriting. Her name in care of the Dusty Creek Post Office, from the Dusty Creek Deputy Sheriff's Office, which was 300 yards away on the same street, which meant he had put it in the outgoing mail rather than simply walk over and hand it to her, which was either very formal or very deliberate, and she suspected it was the second. She sat down at the sorting table and opened it. It was not long. Silas, she had learned, was economical with words in proportion to the weight he gave them, which meant a short letter from him carried more freight per line than a long letter from most people. It said the following: I am aware that my thanks for what you did in the matter of Hale's scheme were inadequate. I am aware that what you did was not merely practical assistance, but required a form of courage that I should have named plainly at the time. I am also aware that I am better at writing things than saying them, and that there is something I have been failing to say that has been failing to leave my head for some time. I would like to take a walk with you on Sunday afternoon, if you are willing, to the East Ridge and back, which is approximately 2 hours, and provides a view of the valley that I have been told is worth the effort. I have never taken that walk with someone I wanted to take it with, and I would like to rectify that. If the answer is no, I will continue to collect the sheriff's mail with the same efficiency as before, and nothing between us need change. If the answer is yes, I will be outside the post office at 2 o'clock Sunday. She read it twice. She set it down. She looked at the wall for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote 3 words on the smallest piece of paper she had available and put it in an envelope, and addressed it to the deputy sheriff's office and put it in the outgoing mail, which meant that Silas would receive it in approximately 2 hours. The 3 words were, 2 o'clock Sunday. She went back to sorting the mail with a focus that was entirely internal and had nothing to do with the letters in her hands. The Sunday walk to the East Ridge and back was, Rosa thought afterward, one of the clearest 2 hours of her life, the kind of time that presents itself in perfect detail because every sense is fully engaged and everything feels significant. They walked out of town in the mild autumn afternoon, following a path that wound through stands of cedar and live oak before beginning the gradual climb to the ridge. They talked, really talked, in the way that they had been approaching for weeks and now finally achieved, without the counter between them or the professional structure that had been both a bridge and a barrier. He told her about his past, the period he had not talked about easily. He had spent 2 years after the war, which ended when he was a boy but whose aftermath reshaped everything, working for a man who turned out to be doing something that Silas could not in conscience continue to be part of. He did not name it directly, but she understood enough. He had walked away from something profitable because it was wrong, and in walking away he had ended up in Dusty Creek, which was not where he had intended to end up but which had turned out to be the place that suited him. She told him about San Antonio, about her father, about what it had felt like to watch the man she most admired in the world spend himself chasing a prosperity that always stayed just ahead of him like a mirage, and how she had learned from that to build her security on things that could not be taken away, on skills and clarity, and the kind of self-knowledge that does not depend on anyone else's valuation. That is either wisdom or loneliness, he said, without cruelty, just honesty. Both, she said. They have the same posture. He looked at her sideways. Yes, he said. They do. The ridge gave them the view he had promised, the valley spread below in the late afternoon light, the town a small, particular arrangement of rooftops and smoke, the ranches visible as geometric patterns in the grass, the limestone ridges framing everything in rough, ancient lines. It was the kind of view that puts human scale in perspective, and standing there with the wind off the ridge and the light changing, she felt something loosen in her chest that had been held for a long time. He was standing beside her close enough that their arms were nearly touching. "What made you write the letter rather than ask me in person?" she said. He considered this with the seriousness he brought to all direct questions. "Because the in-person version has an audience," he said, "and because I wanted you to be able to say no without having to do it to my face." She looked up at him. "That is either very considerate or very cowardly." "Both," he said, which was her word and her phrasing from 20 minutes earlier given back to her, and the smile it produced on his face was the fullest one she had seen from him, open and real and something like a relief, as if he had been carrying that smile for a while and was glad to set it down somewhere it could be seen. She laughed, which surprised them both. They stood there on the ridge in the late light for longer than the walk technically required, and then they came back down together through the cedar and live oak with the evening coming on and the town beginning to light its lamps. And at the door of the post office he stood for a moment with his hat in his hand and said he hoped they could do this again. And she said she thought they probably should, and that was the beginning of it, the real beginning, the acknowledged one. The months that followed were the kind of months that, when Rosa looked back on them later, she would think of as the months of becoming known to each other in the full, unreserved way that requires time and repetition, and the willingness to be seen during the ordinary moments, not just the extraordinary ones. They walked to the ridge regularly, and to other places too, the creek south of town that ran clear over white limestone in winter, the small grove of pecans that the Ray's family had planted 20 years ago and maintained with a devotion that showed in every tree. Maria Reyes, the matriarch of that family, noticed Rosa and Silas walking near the grove one February afternoon and came out to speak to them with the warmth of a woman who had been told what Rosa had done in writing the letter in Spanish. And she brought them in for coffee and something sweet she had made, and the afternoon extended in the way that afternoons do when they are in the presence of something genuinely good. Silas's relationship with the Ray's family became something important to him, Rosa observed. He had always been fair in his official capacity, which was not nothing in a time and place where being fair to Mexican families was not automatic, but fair and connected were different things, and he was becoming connected, through Rosa's ease with the family, and through the family's willingness to extend themselves toward someone who had proved himself worth extending toward. Sheriff Prout watched all of this with the satisfied expression of a man whose chess pieces are moving as intended. He told Silas in March, in the plain way of old men who have earned directness, that Rosa Grady was the finest development in Dusty Creek's social landscape in a considerable time, and that Silas should not make the mistake of being so deliberate about everything that he accidentally lost what he most wanted to keep. Silas received this advice with the contained expression that most of Prout's advice received and then, apparently, took it. He came to the post office on a Thursday morning in March, when the desert was beginning its brief, brilliant spring, and the air smelled of something new, and he waited for Arthur Crane to step out for his constitutional with the patience of a man who has a specific purpose, and is not in a hurry about the execution of it, but is also not inclined to delay further. When the door closed behind Arthur, Silas put both hands on the counter and looked at Rosa with the directed, unambiguous intensity that she had come to understand was his version of complete honesty. "I am not good at being in between," he said, "at having something that is not quite defined and waiting to see what it becomes. I am better with things that are stated plainly." She looked at him with all the attention she had. "Then state it plainly." "I love you," he said. "That is the plain statement, and I would like to know if you will marry me, not because we have been walking out together for months and it is expected, but because I cannot imagine making decisions about my life without thinking about where you are in the picture, and I would rather that be official." She held his gaze for a moment that felt suspended. "Also," he added, with the slight awkwardness of a man pushing past his available eloquence, "you are the most intelligent person I have met in this town, and I would not like to spend the rest of my life across a counter from you." She came around the end of the counter, which was not something she had done before in their many conversations, and she stood in front of him, and she put her hand against his jaw, which was warm and slightly rough, and said, "Yes, of course, yes. I love you too, and I have been waiting for you to be plain about it for approximately 6 months." He exhaled as if something very large had just been set down, and then he put his arms around her and held her with the same steady, deliberate certainty he brought to everything else. And she thought, standing there in the middle of the post office with the morning mail waiting and the spring air coming under the door, that she had never felt more specifically, accurately in the right place. They married in June. The wedding was held at the church on a Saturday afternoon with the whole town apparently in attendance, which was either a testament to their popularity or to the fact that Dusty Creek was, like all small towns, hungry for celebration. Arthur Crane cried openly and without apology. Hector Potts wore his best coat and beamed with the righteousness of a man whose complicated plan had produced a result even better than the one he had aimed for. The Ray's family brought food that made the church reception an occasion of genuine festivity. Even Sheriff Prout wore his good hat, which he had not been seen in since the previous Christmas. Eleanor Marsh gave Rosa a beautiful blue silk handkerchief that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother and said, entirely without irony, that she had never been so delighted to have received a forged love letter in her life, and Rosa laughed and hugged her, and it was exactly the right note. Silas, in the small private moment before the ceremony when he stood with Rosa in the vestibule and the organ was beginning inside, said very quietly, "I keep thinking about the letter, about how it started. Hector's elaborate mechanism," she said. "A letter meant for someone else." He looked at her with the full, open warmth she had worked hard to earn and now received as her ordinary portion. "It is not the most conventional beginning. We are not particularly conventional people," she said. No, his hand found hers. "We are not." They went in together. The year after the wedding was a year of good things, which Rosa catalogued internally with the pleasure of someone who has spent enough time in scarcity to appreciate abundance when it arrives. The post office work continued, expanded to include a more formal position when Arthur Crane's hearing deteriorated enough that he needed more consistent help, and negotiated a partnership arrangement that made Rosa a co-postmistress, which was an unusual arrangement for 1883, but which Arthur presented to the Postmaster General's regional office with such cheerful confidence that no one argued with it. Silas was appointed full sheriff in September of that year, when Amos Prout retired to the rocking chair with his checkers and his arthritic knees, and a pension fund that the town had quietly assembled as a tribute. Silas's appointment was unopposed, which was itself a statement about what 4 years of steady, fair, thorough work looked like to the people who had lived under it. With the sheriff's salary, they bought a small house on the good side of the main street, close enough to town to be convenient and far enough from the saloon to be peaceful, with a garden plot in the back where Rosa planted things, with the focused pleasure of someone making permanent marks on the land. By winter she was expecting their first child, which she discovered by the slow, specific accumulation of evidence that her body provided before she was prepared to admit what it meant. And when she told Silas, he was quiet in a way that was not troubled but was profound, the quiet of a man reckoning with something enormous. "Good," he said at last, which was perhaps the most understated response to impending fatherhood she could imagine, and she loved him completely for it. The child arrived in the summer of 1884, a boy they named Henry James Walden, James for Silas's father who had died when Silas was 12, and Henry because Rosa had always loved the name without knowing precisely why. He was a solid, serious-faced infant who looked, in the opinion of everyone who saw him, exactly like his father, which Rosa confirmed was true and found unexpectedly delightful. Hector Potts came to meet Henry with the solemnity of a man paying a formal call, and held him with the careful, slightly terrified hands of someone who does not hold babies often, and the baby stared up at him with the dark, unreadable gaze of the very newly arrived, and Hector said softly, more to himself than to anyone, "There you are." Rosa, watching from the chair where she was resting, felt something complete. The Conrad Hale trial concluded in the spring of 1884 with a conviction on 4 counts of fraud and 1 of conspiracy, and Hale received a sentence of 7 years in the state penitentiary. Purnell received a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony, and was barred from any public office in the state of Texas for life. The three families whose land had been threatened received their titles confirmed by the circuit court in a proceeding that Silas attended as a witness, and which Rosa read about in the newspaper. He brought home and felt a clean, clear satisfaction over. The Reyes family came to dinner that evening, and Maria Reyes brought her tamales and her granddaughter, who was learning to read, and who sat very straight at the table with the dignity of a child who has been taught that dignity is something you carry rather than something you receive. And Silas watched her with the expression of a man who is taking mental notes about the kind of father he wants to be. Sheriff Walden, as he was now officially, continued to run a department that was known throughout the county for its consistency and its fairness, including in matters that were not always popular. When a dispute arose between one of the old ranching families and a newer Mexican settler over the use of a water source, Silas investigated it with the same meticulous attention he would have given any dispute and found in favor of the settler, whose claim was stronger, and held that finding under sustained pressure from people who had expected a different outcome. It cost him some social goodwill from certain quarters and gained him considerably more from others, and he regarded the balance with the practical equanimity of a man who had decided long ago what he would not compromise. Rosa watched this and was proud of him with a specificity that she found words for sometimes, and sometimes did not need words for at all. Their second child came in 1886, a girl they named Clara, who arrived in the world at a high volume and maintained that volume consistently for the first several months of her life, in a way that made both parents look at each other over her head, with the helpless, exhausted, entirely smitten expressions of people who know they are defeated and are not sorry about it. Henry, who was 2 by then, regarded his sister with the grave, assessing attention of a small person, confronting something confusing and important, and decided within a week that she was acceptable, which made Rosa so happy she cried in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching, and Silas found her there and put his arms around her from behind without asking why, because he understood without needing to ask. Hector Potts's health declined in the winter of 1886, the way old men's health declines, not all at once but in incremental retreats, and Rosa spent considerable time at his house during his worst days, making sure he had food and fire and company. He talked a great deal during those visits, the wide-ranging, retrospective talk of someone organizing a life into something coherent, and she listened with the full attention that he had always given her. He died in February of 1887, peacefully and at home, and Rosa was there, and so was Silas, and Hector went with the same wry, intelligent, slightly knowing expression that he had worn for as long as Rosa had known him, as if the last thing he registered was the confirmation of something he had expected. She arranged the burial, and she spoke at the small service, and she said that Hector Potts had been a man who knew the difference between what could be done and what could be done through other people, and who had been unashamed of the second kind when the first was not available to him. She said he had used her and known it and apologized for it, and that in the apology and the using both she had recognized someone who was trying to do something real in a world that did not always reward that effort, and that she was grateful, specifically and permanently, for the complicated mechanism of trust that had brought her here. She said the last part looking at Silas, who was sitting in the front pew with Henry on his knee and Clara asleep against his shoulder, and he held her gaze with the steady, clear warmth that she received from him every day now, and that still, she was grateful to discover, registered with the same force it had registered the first time she let herself feel it. The letter on the dresser in their bedroom was framed by then, which had been Silas's idea, and which Rosa had initially called impractical, and then been moved by in a way that rendered her incapable of argument. It was the letter, Hector's letter in Silas's forged hand, the letter meant for Eleanor Marsh that had found its way to Rosa's hands and set everything in motion. Silas had written on a small card beneath it, in his actual hand, the real one she had come to know as well as her own, a letter meant for someone else. Everything we have came from something that should never have reached us. She looked at it sometimes in the morning when the light came in the east window, and Henry was banging something in the kitchen, and Clara was demanding breakfast in her emphatic fashion, and she felt the whole chain of unlikely things that connected the letter to this house, to these people, to the life that was hers in the most complete and specific sense she could imagine. In the spring of 1888, the town of Dusty Creek had grown enough that the original post office was insufficient, and Arthur Crane, who had retired the previous year to a well-deserved rest but still came in twice a week to offer opinions, supported Rosa's proposal to the Postmaster General's regional office for an expanded facility with genuine enthusiasm and the kind of testimonial letter that closes debates before they start. The new post office opened in May, a proper building with a real counter and 2 sorting rooms and a door with a brass handle, and Rosa stood in it on the opening morning with the particular satisfaction of someone looking at a thing they built. Silas brought the children down that morning to see it, Henry now 4 and serious and interested in everything, Clara 2 and furiously mobile, and Rosa showed Henry the sorting system with genuine pleasure, explaining how everything had a place and a root and a purpose, and Henry listened with an attention that made Silas catch Rosa's eye over the children's heads with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy that she would keep somewhere in the interior of herself for the rest of her life. That evening, sitting on the porch of their house in the long spring light with the children inside with Maria Reyes's granddaughter, who had become their regular helper as she grew older and who read to Henry with a seriousness that delighted everyone, Silas put his arm around Rosa's shoulders, and she leaned into him with the completeness of someone who has found the specific shape that fits. "Are you happy?" he said, which was not a question he asked often, being more likely to read her than to ask her, and the fact that he asked it told her he was thinking about something. "I am very happy," she said. "What are you thinking about?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was assembling something precise. "I was thinking about the Reyes family's younger son," he said. "Eduardo, he has been asking about whether there is a pathway to working in law enforcement that does not require connections he does not have." He paused. "I am thinking about whether I can create a deputy position that would be appropriate for him." She looked at him. "That would be significant." "Yes," he said, "it would. There will be opposition." "Yes," he said again, "there will. I have been thinking about the kind of opposition and how to prepare for it." She looked out at the street, at the town in the long evening light, at the world that was both more and less than she had expected when she stepped off the southbound stage with her 2 trunks and her Dickens novel and her determination to last until something better presented itself. Something better had presented itself. More specifically, someone better had, in the form of a forged letter and a forged crisis and a walk to an East Ridge and a man who wrote the things he could not say and then learned, slowly and with her specific encouragement, to say them too. "Appoint Eduardo," she said. He looked at her. "You know it is right," she said. "And you have never let knowing it was right be insufficient reason." He held her gaze for a moment, and she saw in his face the same thing she had seen on that ridge 5 years ago, the fullest version of his smile, the one that was both settled and alive. "No," he said, "I have not." He pulled her a little closer. "That is your influence." "You were already that person," she said. "I just made it easier to be him." He pressed a kiss to her temple, which was a thing he did with a regularity and a gentleness that she received every time as both the ordinary and the extraordinary, which was the thing about a good love she had come to understand. It was not that it stopped being significant. It was that significance and ordinary became the same thing. Inside the house, Henry's voice rose in a question, answered by the patient, clear reading voice of the Reyes girl, followed by Clara's commentary, which was largely vowels and enthusiasm at this stage of her development. Silas laughed quietly against her hair. Eduardo Reyes was appointed deputy in August of 1888, and the opposition was as predicted and managed as prepared. And within 6 months, it had settled into something like the ordinary resentment of people who disagree with a decision, rather than the active hostility of people who mean to reverse it, which was progress enough. Eduardo himself turned out to be diligent, perceptive, and possessed of a quiet authority that reminded Rosa, watching him in his early months, of a younger Silas, not in appearance but in the quality of attention he brought to things that needed attention. She said this to Silas, and he looked quietly pleased, which was its own kind of satisfaction. By the summer of 1889, Rosa was expecting their third child, which the doctor confirmed in June, and which Henry received with the philosophical acceptance of a child who has already been through this once, and Clara received with demands for information about where exactly the baby was and whether it would have enough room, and when it would be ready to play. The baby arrived in November, another boy, whom they named James, after the name they had already given as a middle name to Henry but which Rosa felt deserved to stand alone, and who came into the world with his eyes open and his expression evaluating, as if arriving with a specific agenda. 3 children, a house with a garden. A husband who was also the person she most enjoyed talking to. Work that was hers, real and independent and skilled. A town that had been threatened and survived, and was growing into something more complicated and more interesting than it had been. She stood at the window of the bedroom one cold November morning when baby James was 3 weeks old and Henry was at school and Clara was allegedly napping, but was in fact arranging her collection of rocks by a system of her own devising, and she looked at the framed letter on the dresser. A letter meant for someone else. What a strange, specific, necessary thing. What a precisely improbable beginning. A forged hand, a frightened old man, a panicked schoolteacher, an open seal, and a woman at the sorting table who knew the difference between one person's handwriting and another's, and who cared that she did. She heard Silas's step on the stair, the particular rhythm of it that she could identify in the dark, the step of a man who is being quiet on purpose because there is a sleeping baby in the house, and she smiled at the letter on the dresser before she turned. He came in with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table beside her and stood next to her at the window. The town was visible below, the mid-morning traffic of an ordinary Wednesday, horses and wagons and the small human movements of people going about the business of being alive in one specific place. Eduardo handled the meet-your-boundary dispute well, he said. I am going to give him more independent responsibility. Good, she said. They stood at the window in the quiet of the house. Are you thinking about the letter again? He said. She looked at him. How did you know? He nodded toward the dresser without looking at it. You only stand at that window with that expression when you are thinking about beginnings. He sipped his coffee. I think about it too. What might have been different? Nothing, she said. I think nothing might have been different, and also everything might have been different, and both are true at the same time. He considered this. Hector would have liked that formulation, he said. He would have argued with it for an hour and then agreed with it. Silas made a sound that was both agreement and amusement, and put his free arm around her, and she leaned into him with the same completeness as always. The specific, chosen, daily completeness of 2 people who have decided each other and keep deciding, every ordinary morning, in the presence of their children and their work and their town and their letter in its frame. The letter meant for someone else that had been, in all the ways that matter, exactly meant for them. Outside, the town of Dusty Creek went about its November Wednesday with the ordinary, remarkable business of being a community, complicated and imperfect and real, carrying its history in the limestone under its streets and its future in the children at Alina Marsh's school, and in the voice of Maria Reyes's granddaughter reading to Henry Walden, and in the new deputy doing his rounds with a badge that had not been available to anyone like him 6 years ago, and in the woman at the post office counter, who knew every letter's route and made sure each thing arrived where it was meant to go. Inside the house, baby James stirred and then settled again into sleep, and Clara's voice rose briefly with the inventory of her rock collection. And somewhere down the street Henry was learning something that he would carry forward, and Silas's arm was warm around Rosa's shoulders, and the coffee was strong, and the morning light was moving across the floor of the bedroom in the slow, reliable way of all light, present and then changed, and then present in a new configuration, which was, when she considered it with the full attention she had learned from years of sorting mail and reading situations and reading people, the precise shape of a life that was actually being lived. She turned her face up toward him. He looked down. "Thank you," she said, "not for anything specific or for everything specific, which was the same thing." "Thank you," he said back, with the same meaning, and kissed her in the November morning light of their bedroom with the unhurried certainty of a man who knows exactly where he is and has no intention of being anywhere else. The letter in its frame caught the light from the window, cream-colored and slightly creased, the forged handwriting still legible, the shape of Silas Walden's name in a hand that was not quite his own, addressed to a woman who had redirected it with alarm, found by the woman who needed to find it, carried by the man who had not written it toward the life he had not planned, and into the love he had not looked for and would, if asked, have chosen every time.